Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to episode 3 of the Freight Desk. And a warm welcome to my partner in crime and co-host here, Andrew. Good
Good
afternoon,
to
sir.
good to see you again, Graham.
Good to be back. Um, as always in supply chain, it's never smooth seas, pardon the pun. Always some sort of choppy waters. The last episode we touched on tariffs and talked about the potential effects, and we talked about the early headaches that they were starting to cause. Here we are recording on July 17th, and things are a little bit different. Do you think they've settled down a bit now?
I think trade has settled down. I don't know if the effect of the tariffs has necessarily settled down, but at the very least, from what we've seen, it's things are a little bit more calm in terms of the volumes of cargo that's moving. And there's still plenty of question marks on what's going to happen here in the future for tariffs, but um, we're normally getting into peak season right now in traditional trans-Pacific trades and sometimes the transatlantic as well. And it seems to be we're headed out of a peak season.
Wow. It's so crazy to think about again these kind of peaks and troughs. I mean, again, we're in July. Cargo volumes in May were abysmal, and they picked back up in June. And now here we are in July, and we're talking about potential early peaks of peak season. Has it passed? Are people overstocking? Um, and I think it's fair to say that the rates are starting to slide again.
Yeah, and so to kind of take one little step back, we've seen in international shipping, which is dominated by the Trans-Pacific market. Asia, Europe is another important part of that picture, but Trans-Pacific is a very heavily influenced part of the market in relation to these tariffs. Since sort of Q4 of last year, what we've seen is essentially a rush to get cargo here to the U.S. After the U.S. elections and after the new president took came into office, tariffs then became the conversation piece. They were then implemented, and everyone rushed to get their cargo out of Asia before the first implementation. There was then a pausing period, and everyone sort of flooded the market with as much cargo as they could over the last sort of 2.5 months to get it here before the end of the pause period. Here at July 17th, we're at that end of that pause period. And the questions ahead are, what's that going to mean for the rest of the year in terms of shipping? It's starting to look like demand has really dropped off. The question is it going to stay off? Is it going to be turned off? A very muted summer for most importers, and it seems like that is going to be the direction we're headed. Well, we will have some question marks that'll be answered with the tariffs, but in terms of what's shipping on the Trans-Pacific, things are calming down, and carriers are maybe going to start to have those conversations. Do we pull capacity? We haven't seen really that happen yet, but it definitely looks like it's coming soon. And so less capacity, does that have any effect on rates? I think the ocean carriers hope it has an effect on rates, but rates are receding on the Trans-Pacific trade at 25 plus percent month over month changes, which is pretty significant in terms of a downward direction.
Wow, that's a huge drop. Of course, if you look at the levels that Transpac annual contracts were set at pre the tariffs, um, and you look at spot rates, is it fair to say that spot rates are still kind of trending quite a bit above the annual contract rates?
Yeah, they're definitely above. We'd have to look at the specific rate data to confirm exactly where they are, but they're still above the contractual rates. That's if that scenario presents itself where spot rates get at or below where the contractual rates are, then we're in a very bad situation for BCOs because carriers would significantly pull out that cargo. Generally speaking, ocean carriers are moving percentages of their cargo at fixed rates and percentages of their cargoes at FAK floating rates, if you will. And when those floating rates get close to those contractual rates, then things start to get pretty ugly from a capacity management standpoint on the carrier side. I think we're not there yet, but we're definitely at a situation where spot rates have come down, 25% is a significant number, month over month. And does that continue? Do we start to see 40% versus where we were, a month or two ago on the spot basis? That changes a lot of ocean carriers' deployment plans. They might move some ships back to Asia, Europe. They might move some ships to the Africa trade as they did previously when the Trans-Pacific hit that wall of, okay, now there's a X% tariff and trade turned off. We'll see where we're headed. We won't know until we get there, but it definitely looks like that's a possibility.
Yeah. And I think in the midst of that, particularly tough period from say, the middle of April to the middle of May, where, the tariffs were seemed to be going up every other day, and we were at 145% on China. Um, it strikes me that, you know, as a BCO and here at Chip Intro, we're lucky enough to work with some of the world's biggest shippers. It's incredibly difficult. We're talking to our customers and they've got cargo stuck all over the place. They don't know if they can move or should move, and it's a waiting game. It's super difficult. And then, things change so fast. When you think about, even during COVID, what we saw with a lot of big shippers was that they wanted a China plus strategy. So, they wanted to mitigate the risk on China and move some of that volume to a second country, be that Vietnam or even near shore it to Mexico. But we also know that, this is a giant process. One household name um, sports retailer, let's say, we know that they're in the middle of it and they're 4 years in, and they're nowhere near finished the process. You hear stats that, moving the iPhone would take 10 years. So it's incredibly difficult as a BCO, I guess, if you're trying to think about now China's settled back down, there is still a tariff. Do you continue on with that China plus? Do you kind of, what do you do as a BCO? It's so difficult, right?
Oh, it's extremely difficult. I think everyone's trying though. Everyone's doing the best they can to diversify their sourcing strategy on a new good procurement basis that is in concert with their logistics. And I think what companies have found, and from my own, experience in a similar scenario, it's not easy to find new suppliers that at the end of the day you have to make a decision. Should we buy from these people? And a lot of the times it's like, I don't know. I don't know if we should. And they could be the nicest people. You could be getting a great deal, but there's some sort of quality issue that needs to be overcome. There's some sort of transportation challenge that needs to be overcome. At the end of the day, I think most mature supply chains for the largest companies in the world, they're doing everything they can to diversify. And I think we would be shocked to see that they're probably nowhere close to be able to say, hey, we're diversified. We're still a China plus point one instead of one.
It's also really interesting to pick up on one of your previous points about where when the Transpac was kind of frozen out in the middle of April, where carriers were looking at where could they deploy, particularly the large mega vessels. Um, I remember being in Lagos in probably 2009 and seeing what they called the big blue ship, the Maersk ship coming in, and it was probably like 3 to 5,000 TEUs maybe, and it was absolutely enormous, both in terms of size and for scale into West Africa, and now you see carriers putting in like 15,000 TEU plus giant ships into Africa. So it's also interesting to see on one side you have the consumers, the shippers looking to diversify from China. Plus, to an extent, you also see China diversifying, right? They're looking to have maybe a better split or more growth on a global basis. Obviously the US is probably just bigger than Europe, and then but there's so much growth in the other markets as well. I was in the Middle East last year, and there was more Chinese cars on the road in that country than anywhere else. So there's a lot of growth out of China to those trade lanes as well, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. economies of scale in ocean freight always wins. And so wherever you can put a bigger vessel, lower your cost and carry more cargo potentially, I mean, you have to push, it's the margins. It's living in the margins and pushing each time you have a an opportunity to make a dollar more by inputting, a dollar. The ocean carriers, the BCOs are always going to look for it. And I think it's definitely happening and it's going to continue to happen. A question I have for you, Graham, and some of your perspective, not just because you have lived in Europe, but you've worked in Europe your mostly your whole career, is how are these tariffs that we're talking about are mostly a U.S. centric situation. How are they playing out in Europe? What's the life of a European importer look like in comparison to a U.S. based importer?
Yeah, it was really interesting again in that kind of mid-April to mid-May when things were particularly frozen. You had all of the US importers from China and Asia, having just incredibly difficult time. Like it was utter chaos. I remember a few days where people were saying this is COVID-esque level of disruption. You just didn't know if you could ship, and the tariff would increase the next day. And could you find another factory? Could you get it from another factory in Southeast Asia? It was utter chaos to see it. And then, we would speak to some European customers, and they would, not only say, well, we're just shipping our cargo this month the same as we've done for the last 3 months. I mean, I think there was also an element of trying to, take advantage of that from a carrier perspective too, and try and grow the European volumes a bit. But I think, the European consumer is under a lot more pressure than the American consumer. And I think if you look at consumption in Europe, I think it's lower than the US, and I think there's a bit more pressure there. So it was kind of almost bizarre to see like extreme pressure on, companies shipping from China to the US, and then almost none on the Europeans. But I think just a weakness in some of the countries, um, particularly, the UK and to a lesser extent Germany, I think are under huge effects. And I think, there's obviously a lot going on in Europe as well in geopolitical terms.
The geopolitics is a tough one to sort of quantify in international ocean shipping, but one that is often overlooked. It's in the headlines every day. If you look at the New York Post or the Wall Street Journal, the major newspapers, you see a lot about the Ukraine-Russia war. One of the things that we talk about not as much in ocean freight is how that effect is having on international transportation. There is plenty of ocean cargo that moves through the Red Sea, or not the Red Sea, the Black Sea, in and out of, the ports there, Ukraine included. There was some challenges around getting cargo out of Ukraine for a while. They've kind of subsided a little bit. But what we don't hear about is the political effect of that war in Eastern Europe, how it's affecting the international shipping market. And recently, and again, this is just talk. We don't know if this actually gets implemented or not, but there was a discussion of secondary tariffs at 50% that was announced by the United States potentially on not necessarily Russian exports because the US doesn't necessarily buy much of anything from Russia. It's more, dear China, dear India, you buy and sell with Russia. Here's a 50% tariff. That's going to have a huge effect. Don't you think, Graham?
Yes, definitely. I think from a US and European perspective, those types of sanctions makes sense to try and kind of force a resolution. It's a terrible conflict, and I think it'll be very interesting because, like you said, Andrew, it's going to force China and India, because obviously they do a lot of trade, both energy and otherwise, with Russia, and I think it'll put a lot of pressure on both China and India, I think, to put pressure on Russia to try kind of come to the table so um, we can get to a resolution. But I do think that that it's also causing a lot of pressure in Europe. A lot of the governments are looking to increase spend on defense by 1 or 2%, and Eastern Europe, parts of Eastern Europe, I think, are on, I wouldn't say high alert, but there's a lot of pressure there. And um, there's a lot of there's a lot of even in transport terms, there's a huge amount of trade between Russia and China. Like if you look at the growth of the trains that have been moving from China to Europe for possibly the best part of a decade now, and they're moving through kind of a lot of this the Kazakhstan areas and through Russian territories, and how could that be affected? I know it's something that Russia and China are working very closely together on. They made an agreement as recently as this month where a Chinese vessel was allowed to move up through the Arctic by the Russians to try and move cargo up that way as well. So, the relationship between those countries, both on trade and energy and otherwise, are pretty significant. So, I think it'll be very interesting to see. What the outcome here is. The 50% is obviously a massive number. I think we all hope that it kind of brings people to their senses and brings them to the table. But unfortunately, it could just be kind of, you know, another kind of version of a crisis that we move to. I mean, it feels like since COVID, we've just gone from like big crisis to small crisis to medium crisis to small crisis. We don't ever have a period of no crisis anymore. It's super super difficult. Um, but it's also relative, right? I mean, um, it's very serious, but the world is still spinning, the world is still moving. Um, I know you had some stats, Andrew, that were super interesting in terms of like the US economy. Um, and to be very honest with you, I didn't fully realize them, but I think it's worth kind of like going through them quickly because again, it just shows the strength of the US consumer.
Yeah, and so like we talk about tariffs and trade and what's going to happen, this 50% tariff on the on Russia, secondary tariffs, all of this is very negative headlines for someone who's trying to manage international trade or trying to buy cargo and move a supply chain. What's really interesting is despite all of these challenges, despite the amount of hair loss in a lot of the American importers who've had to manage these challenges, generally speaking, the US economy really hasn't changed a ton. And so one of the key, macro, my hopefully my macroeconomic college professor is jumping for joy to hear some of these stats be mentioned in a podcast about freight. But inflation is a very important number of that economicists, I can't pronounce the word, follow. And in June, the inflation was at 0.03% increase. And so all of these tariffs, all of this information really changed inflation a very small amount. It increased, we can't deny that fact, but it increased 0.3%. And if you look at a 10-year running average, the current inflation rate in the United States economy is 2.7%, which is well below the 10-year average.
Wow.
So we're trending still below 10-year averages inflations. Additionally, if you start to look at core CPI or the consumer price index, that is only up 0.2%, which is a very small number. But there are increases in apparel and home furnishings that are greater than 0.2%. But if we look at the core pricing data that the US economy produces, it's increased at 0.2%. Again, I'm going to argue that's a very small number. You roll all that up into GDP numbers, the global GDP outlook, so not just the US, but the entire globe, and as measured as gross domestic product, is still looking like for 2025 a 2.3% increase. And so we're still talking global GDP growth. Additionally, if you start to project long term, what does that look like for 2026? People way smarter than Graham, you and I are saying 2.4% in 2026. So we're still talking growth, which is wonderful to hear. Despite all the challenges, the global economy is still growing. The US economy specifics on GDP growth, we're still in a potential 2% growth of 2025 numbers, and we're still expecting growth in 2026. That number is at 0.3% for 2026, but like in general, we're seeing growth still being discussed. And if you boil all that away and you say, well, what about Europe, which is an important part of the global economy? Asia, Europe, and the US are probably three of the biggest pieces. They're still looking at 0.9% growth for 2025 and 1.1% growth. Despite everything that's happening, all of the challenges, all of the amount of work that's going in, we're still talking about growth.
Wow, super interesting. And I think that's actually a good segue for us to shift gears relatively dramatically here when you think about uh, growth outlooks and how the world's going to change in 2026 and 2027. Um, we can't have that conversation without mentioning the two letters of A and I. It is still um, just incredible the momentum, right? It's like it's just I often say it's like when you look at your iPhone and you get a new version every year and you're very happy with that and it gets incrementally improved within that year. It's the equivalent of one of those every 2 weeks.
And so we talk a lot about the momentum of AI, and you just have to Google AI or you can ask AI about AI and you're going to get a lot of information. But Graham, you've lived in the software world more than anyone at Ship Angel. It seems like the pace of AI change is double what we used to see in software. I think the number is quarterly. In traditional, you'd see updates on a quarterly basis. It seems like AI is iterating in a weekly, monthly. How is the new momentum looking like in terms of the new models that are coming out?
Yeah, I think, if you look back to um, the early computers, like not the earliest, but when things started to kind of pick up in the 60s and 70s and we started to get mainframes, they started to show up in offices and you can look at videos of people in the 1970s saying, when someone said that everybody in will have a computer in their house and everybody laughed. That momentum really started in the 60s and 70s. And then, in the 90s we got the internet. And software has evolved in these kind of growth spurts. We had the internet, which was transformative on a global basis. And then we had cloud software, we had mobile, and cloud and mobile in themselves were pretty transformative. Mobile, if you think about it, we all walk around every day with supercomputers in our pockets that we can talk to somebody with the IQ of Einstein and ask them any question. Um, you know, du- Quadruple the power of what would have landed on the moon back in the day. That type of power is significant. But I really think that AI is transformative more so in kind of in terms of inventing the internet versus say mobile or cloud software or cloud computing. It is just going to change everything. And like you said, Andrew, the pace is just, unrelenting. The Freight Tech 2030 AI newsletter that I write, I remember some of the early editions and I talked about the pace, and people would write to me and say, oh, it's not going to keep that pace for much longer. And that was a year ago. And not only has it kept that pace, it's increased that pace. And not only has it increased that pace, but in that 12-month period, it's moved 5 years, to the point that, again, today's July 17th, we're about a week or so, maybe a little bit less into Grok 4's release. And Tim Sweeney of Epic said it feels like AGI. And I've been using Grok 4 Heavy a lot the last 4 or 5 days. And there are elements of it that definitely feel like that. But I do think that the difference between cloud computing and AI, I heard someone say that AI is going to be more like an invention like electricity or even fire for the human race. And I think in some ways it will. But I think it's also really interesting, Andrew, in our supply chain software world or the supply chain world at large.
I mean, my question for you, Graham, is why does that matter? Why does weekly slash monthly updates to AI's features, why does that matter in supply chain?
I think it matters for two big reasons. First of all, supply chain coming out of COVID has gone like this in terms of the speed of digitization, particularly on the shipper side where we live every day. I think COVID was one of the first times that shippers, particularly Fortune 500 style companies, realized that supply chain is not a cost center, dark corner of your business. If you do not have the right product in the right place at the right time, you hemorrhage top line revenue. And, I think a lot of them felt we're never going to go through this again. We are behind on digitization. We are going to get it done. And while that's being done, we have this generational AI piece follow it. In other industries, it's a bit more difficult because the software is very mature. But in supply chain, you have this incredible digitization speed. Like we see BCO shipper digital budgets going up 4 years in a row, which has never happened before. 4 consecutive years of growth on growth on growth. And at that very moment, as they're digitizing, you have these generative AI models significantly close to artificial general intelligence. And I think what that means, Andrew, in terms of what we do every day, is that AI can power so many systems. It can supercharge humans. It can help them to take away mundane tasks and free them up to become creative and do what they're great at and make some very, very deep um, uh, kind of decisions that are based on significant experience. I think that's what's really exciting about the AI space.
And Graham, one of the things that I know this process very intimately, my team in the operations side of Ship Angel, we process a lot of rate sheets, and we do it be with in concert with artificial intelligence. And so we as a Ship Angel as a company are utilizing the AI not in its necessarily LLM form, but in something we've built that actually is processing information and making our lives easier. What else is the sort of next steps of making logistics software powered by AI make logisticians, as we call them often, how are we making their lives easier?
Yeah, great question, Andrew. I mean, first of all, we're very lucky here at Chip Angel. We're a young company, so it's very easy to call ourselves AI native. But having said that, I mean, our rate AI technology we're very proud of. We know it's the most advanced in the world. It's a 10 pillar architecture that can read any rate sheet. And that's kind of at the corner of our AI stack in rate management. But to be a real true native AI company, I think you need it to be everywhere. And for us, it is everywhere. Last year, we launched our Copilot, where our customers can just talk to their rate data and ask it questions. We can train it in hours on new questions. That's been very successful in tandem with our AI rate architecture. And then on from that, we've been building AI agents for a year now. We have an AI agent that lives in our APIs that interrogates some of the data that comes in before it hits the databases. We have one that looks at things like disparate UN load codes and makes changes and updates it. And we have a lot of interesting plans on other AI agents. But maybe our most ambitious project is a new super assistant. Um, I don't think I can even say the name yet publicly, but again, the idea of this super assistant is that it just lives with you on your screen all of the time. You as the human are the driver, but you've got this super assistant that has been trained on every word that has ever been written on freight forwarding, ocean, air, and trucking. It is an expert on that. It is live plugged into global weather, AIS data, geopolitical events. If you allow it, it can read every one of your POs, all of your booking data, all of your history, and can just prompt you with great data at the right time. Can tell you when something is about to go wrong, when it does go wrong. It can give you suggestions, and when you pick the one you want, you hit a button and it just happens. So there are four examples of where the AI lives entirely throughout our system. And I think that's really important. It does frustrate me, to be brutally honest with you. When people say, "Oh, we've got an AI Copilot, we're AI." It's like Copilot is, you can slap a Microsoft Copilot on your website in like 95, 75 seconds. Um, I mean, really, you want to be creative with these models. You want to take advantage of how wide they are, but make them your own and add value. The one thing that blows my mind, Andrew, is the Fortune 500 right now are, continuing to spend aggressively on technology, just like they have done for the last 25 years, particularly on SaaS. But what's mind blowing is these brand new AI budgets that more often than not they live outside of the software budgets. They're brand new, and these companies are spending billions of dollars. And by the way, I wholeheartedly agree. They should be. They need to get their use cases and test AI really, really quickly. What I say in the newsletter is like you should test these things and get tools that you can get live quickly. You can get results in ROI, and you can double down on them, or you can move on to the next one. And I think it's really important as an industry that supply chain software vendors continue to add significant value in AI, and help these companies at a critical juncture.
It feels like, Graham, we're at a point where investing in AI is not a question of should I or shouldn't I. It's more or less now a conversation of how much do I invest and what baskets do I put my investment eggs into, because I have to try. Because if I don't try, my competitors are trying. And if it gives them a 1% edge over me, now I'm in a disadvantage. And now you're working against the tide versus working with it. And I think that's where we're seeing the AI evolve to, is I have to try it and I have to take some risks in some places, but you have to do it in a very calculated way, like you mentioned. You have to double check and prepare for a potential ROI and track that ROI against every project that you're trying.
Absolutely. And again, it's going to I believe it's going to enhance software a lot. It's going to make software much more useful. There's going to be much more of it. But it's also going to change the way we live. Like right now, somewhere in our office in New York right now, but somewhere in the United States, there are cars driving themselves on the road. And there are robots in factories taking parcels from conveyor belts and putting them in the exact right spot. And yes, they are very small cases compared to the bigger market. But let's go back to what I mentioned earlier, the pace of AI. And to your point, if you don't do anything, there is no, it's not a question of will you win or lose. You're going to lose. It's just a question of will you lose in 9 months or 29 months. So investing early is super important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Graham, we've talked a lot about the international trade situation. We've talked a lot about AI. I think we've touched on some really interesting topics. The question I have for you is what do we see the world? What situation is this world in a month from now? We're going to see a world post tariffs. We're going to see some more iterations on AI. In 1 month, what are we talking about in AI, and what are we talking about potentially in global trade from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the global trade side, it's very interesting to go back to what you said as well, Andrew. Like we're in the middle of July here. What do the critical months of August and September look like on shipping? What are the volumes like? One thing that we say a lot on the rate management side is that it's not about rate management being more important when rates are high and low. It's the delta, it's the variability, it's the amount of times the rates change. That's the where the system comes into its own. It's not that you have to have it at $9,000 and you can live without it at 2,000. It's these constant peaks and troughs. And I think it'll be really interesting to see that, the carriers went through boom and bust cycles for decades upon decades. And then they had the windfall of a lifetime during COVID. And I think you can even see in the results now that there is a level of discipline and maybe confidence that wasn't there before. And if we do get to a case in September where volumes are really slack on the Trans-Pacific, will they look to reroute ships or park up ships rather than the historic, nosedive rates to try get the little bit of cargo that's moving? I think that'll be the really interesting thing to watch. Um, I think on AI, I think expect um, this same level of innovation to continue. Again, we're recording this on the Thursday, the 17th of July at 1:30 p.m. EST. And I know there's an open AI intro going on right now with another brand new product, and we don't know what it is. But depending on who you listen to, people say we're going to have artificial general intelligence in the next 5 months, to kind of maybe 18 to 24 months. So I think that's even hard to quantify. Like, that how does that change? I mean, I think as humans and as businesses and as organizations, we don't always move as fast as we should. So maybe it won't be too dramatic, but I do feel like this technology curve is like nothing we have ever experienced before. And I think as humans, it's very hard for us to understand that. So we will, as I said at the top of the show, Andrew, we're never sailing through calm waters. We're always in choppy waters. So when we go to the next episode, I'm sure we'll have another interesting set of challenges to talk about, and who knows where AI will be by then.
I don't know if you know or I know. I don't know if AI even knows where it's going to be in a month from now. And that's why I wanted to ask that super important question is what we're talking about in a month. Maybe we're no longer talking about the idea of using agents. Now it's how many agents are you using? What types of agents are you using? What models are you using in combination with other models? I think that's the world we're headed, where these are all pieces of a puzzle versus just a single puzzle.
Absolutely. What an interesting time to be alive. And that's it for today, folks. Thank you very much for joining Andrew and I on the Freight Desk episode 3. Look forward to the next one.
Awesome. Graham, you have a good day and we'll talk soon.
You too, sir.